This is a lecture from Open Tuition. To benefit from the lecture, you should download the free lecture notes from opentuition.com.
References to ethics occur throughout the syllabus, but rather than spread it over our lectures, we've brought consideration of ethics together into this one relatively short chapter. Ethics relates to deciding what is right, what is wrong, what is moral, what is immoral, what is acceptable, what is not acceptable or non-acceptable. It's different to consideration of what might be legal, what might be illegal. Generally speaking, if something is illegal, it is probably to be regarded as being unethical. That's assuming that the laws are relatively fair. So we're not dealing with legality here. We're dealing with whether the company and in particular its stakeholders regard certain forms of behavior by the company or the organization as being suitable, correct, righteous, moral, ethical. Ethics are important not only for themselves. We presumably want it to be good people, righteous people. They are an end in itself. But it's also important for a company's reputation. And a company's reputation, if it gets tarnished, can really inhibit and detract from the success of the company or the organization. And it can certainly damage profits in a big way. Areas of ethics, and this is just some of them here, can include the following. Health and safety. So if you were to issue, for example, a product which is going to damage someone, hurt someone, and you knew about that, then that's obviously unethical. Or if you hadn't tested it adequately, that is unethical. Or if you made some kind of play off between, I could test it more, I could improve the product, and that's got a cost, that would make the product more safe. But instead of spending the extra money to improve the safety of the product, you say, well, I'm going to tolerate a certain number of incidents of people being hurt or damaged. It's treatment of employees and suppliers. We have had examples of certain manufacturing companies who manufacture, let's say, in developing countries, and who have been accused of really bad working conditions, child labour and the like. And if that reputation sticks, then of course it can seriously damage the sales and the esteem in which the company is held. Intellectual property rights. From time to time there are quite large court battles, particularly in IT, over which company has the rights to a particular bit of technology. So someone says, I invented the technology, but you've incorporated it into your phone. There can be damages paid, and as well as that, the company making the phone, for example, can be ordered by the court not to use that component anymore. Environmental impact, an increasingly important area of ethical considerations, the amount of waste which is produced, the amount that can be recycled, the carbon footprint, the amount of greenhouse gases which are released. These have all become extremely important issues, certainly in, at the very least, public relations and marketing, and of course more fundamentally they are potentially important to our comfortable survival as a species. Uses of IT. We've talked about big data, or will talk about big data. We know that huge amounts of information is now accumulated by companies, whether it's Google, Facebook, or supermarkets, or internet service providers. We provide them with our preferences, what we like. We provide them with our credit card information. And if that information is not held properly, not collected properly, or if it's used in a way that we didn't give consent to or anticipate, then increasingly I think people are becoming a little unsettled by the power that certain companies have accumulated, perhaps on the quiet, really, and now we're getting kind of worried about it. And then it gets down to the very obvious stuff. To what extent is bribery and the payment of commissions and backhanders, that's in most environments is regarded as being unethical, though in some environments some sort of commission, what's sometimes called grease money, in other words encouraging an official to do faster what the official should do anyway, it's more normal in some environments than in others. So the subject of ethics is very, very wide indeed. What can we say about it a little bit further? Well, first of all, opinions differ. So we have in the UK at the moment, and in some other countries, we have a lot of kind of publicity about what's called fracking. And fracking is where there is natural gas in the Earth's crust, but to get it out, you have to essentially make little explosions down very deeply. This breaks up the rock, the shale, and allows the gas to escape and be caught and brought up for use. Some people think that this is an unethical type of behavior. They worry about earthquakes. They worry about some of the chemicals that may be being used getting into the water supply. They worry anyway about this as another way of producing gas, which is then burnt, which then adds itself to the carbon footprint. Other people see that if you want to heat your house, then using gas is relatively clean compared to coal, and doesn't produce the hazardous atomic waste that you get from nuclear power stations. And these people say, long term we might want to phase out gas, but going for this fracking at the moment, it saves us having to import gas, and there's a cost to that, and it provides us with energy security. So opinions differ in all sorts of areas. What I think is important is that companies and organizations are open and honest about what they're doing and what kind of ethical stance they have, so that stakeholders know, in a way, what they're getting into, what to expect. For example, companies involved in pharmaceuticals, they have to put their pharmaceuticals through very extensive clinical trials to both test that the pharmaceutical is useful, and secondly, that it's not actually harming people. And of course, there is a kind of limit to how much you delay maybe putting that pharmaceutical into production. You can test and test and test and test for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, looking for side effects. But of course, all of that time you are maybe withholding the pharmaceutical from people who need it. So what you have to do is to, kind of come clean with people. We have complied with certain country regulations. We have supplied all the test information to the regulatory authorities. And as far as we know, that's okay. Yet there is always a danger, of course, that some longer term side effect is going to be discovered. But at least you've told the shareholders what they're getting into. Corporate codes of ethics can supply two needs. First of all, it can act as guidance to individuals within the company, basically basically employees, on how they should conduct themselves, what sort of behavior is acceptable, what isn't. And secondly, corporate codes of ethics can be kind of waved at other stakeholders as evidence that we are an ethical company, we're taking ethics seriously. Of course, there can be a gap between what you write down that should be done and what actually should be done. So at the moment, as this recording is going on, Boeing is in some difficulty with its 737 MAX. there were 2 recent crashes with very similar circumstances, and the claim is that there were certain changes made to the way the aeroplane operated without properly informing airlines or pilots. Almost certainly this is going to go to court, but the Boeing Corporation is putting up some kind of stiff resistance, saying, safety is our priority. It comes top of the list, and we would never ever compromise safety to save money on building the plane. It may take court hearings to discover to what extent, if at all, any compromises have been made. It's also important that employees undergo training. You can't just hand a kind of copy of the company ethical code to employees and expect them to read it and understand it and be able to make proper judgments. Training will normally involve presenting people with little ethical dilemmas, discussing what should or shouldn't be done, and trying to raise the awareness amongst people that ethics are important. Disciplinary procedures also have to be used, telling people if you break these ethical guidelines, then you're going to get into trouble. And also we should maybe add here that it's important to give employees some methodology where if they're troubled about an ethical question, they know where to go in the company to get some ethical guidance, rather than just trying to make up their own mind for sometimes situations which are really quite ambiguous and difficult to resolve. Apart from ethics being something which are morally worth pursuing for themselves, it's important to realize that there's a very good business sense, a very good business case for adopting ethical behavior. If you don't adopt ethical behavior, I think nowadays you can be pretty sure you're going to be found out. With social media, with Twitter, Facebook, people being easily able to record video footage and so on, you can be pretty sure that if an employee or another stakeholder really feels strongly that what you're doing is wrong, that information will be leaked. So if you're going to be found out, and if it's discovered that you were unethical, there will be fines and damages. And these fines and damages will be almost certainly greater than if you had just kind of come clean about a problem. So there have been instances of pharmaceutical companies where, let's say, 5 years after a drug was discovered, then a side effect was discovered. Now that's part and parcel of being a drug company. You always live in fear that some longer term side effect will be discovered, and everyone buys into that, okay. But what really hurt the companies involved was that evidence came to light that they always knew that there was this danger of side effects, and they had suppressed that information so that the drug would sell better. Now when that sort of concealment of a problem comes out, then really all hell breaks loose. There are going to be much higher fines, there are going to be punitive damages. The regulators are going to come in, like a ton of bricks, really, and say, how has this happened? And maybe new laws are even introduced, which set up, considerable costs in the future for you. There will be a loss of reputation, and a loss of reputation is important, because you will lose sales. Why would you buy from an unethical company if there was an ethical competitor? If you have a reputation of being unethical, then you can be sure that the regulators will look at you more closely. They won't trust you. If you have a reputation for being unethical, there will be increased perceived risk. What other skeletons are there in the cupboard? We've discovered you've been doing this wrong, but if you're also doing all these other things wrong, if you're kind of fast and loose with your ethical stance, there could be lots more fines and damages and kind of problems which are going to be uncovered very soon. And once there is increased perceived risk, there are increased costs of finance. Because the cost of finance, whether shares or debt, is closely attuned to perceived risk. Higher risk means that shareholders demand a higher return to compensate them for that higher risk. And right back at the beginning of the lectures, we talked about performance and conformance. We talked about risk appetite. But you can only make sense of these concepts if the risk is made plain to you. And some sort of unethical behavior which is kept secret and then which ensures that you have a kind of bad reputation associated with you is going to increase the perceived risk and increase the costs of capital. Again, a poor reputation, you will find it harder to recruit the best employees. Think of a new engineering graduate wanting to make a career in a good company. Why would you choose a company which has got this dreadful reputation if you could choose a rival which seems to be much better in terms of its ethical stance? And also, many companies nowadays, as a method of growth and development of new products, want to get into joint ventures of some sort of collaboration or strategic cooperation with other companies. Often because developing the new products is very expensive and is inherently full of risk if this large development goes wrong. And if you want to get into an association with another company, why would I want to marry up, so to speak, to be associated with a company that had a reputation of concealing important information, of sharp practice and so on, of not dealing with its customers correctly? That would simply tarnish my image as well. CIMA has its own professional ethics guide, if you like, or code. Basically, this comes from the International Ethics Standard Board for Accountants, which CIMA has adopted. And as CIMA members or students, we have to make sure that our ethical choices are guided by the CIMA ethical code. It can be enforced by laws, monitoring, training, internal controls, leadership, discipline and communication. And the ethical framework says that there are certain threats. It says also that we have got within this fundamental principles. These fundamental principles are subject to certain threats. And what we need to do is to employ safeguards. It's kind of forewarned is forearmed. If you say there's a certain threat, then maybe you can avoid it completely, or maybe you can employ some sort of safeguard which brings down that threat to what's called an acceptable level. Not all threats can be completely eliminated, but we have to get them down to what's called an acceptable level. The 5 fundamental principles are as follows. Integrity. You must be straightforward and honest. You must stand up for what you believe in. You mustn't turn a blind eye. If you think that someone is concealing information that may, say that this product may harm customers, you can't pretend you didn't see that. That is not exercising any sort of integrity. Objectivity. You should avoid bias, conflict of interest, undue influence. If what you're doing is trying to assess whether or not to open a particular factory or close down a factory or open operations abroad and so on, you must concentrate on that. You mustn't be influenced by, for example, personal gain, or certainly not influenced by the promise of some sort of backhander or bribe. Professional competence and due care. You mustn't stray into making decisions in areas that you have little competence about. Otherwise, you're not doing much more than guessing. You must spend enough time and energy coming to properly thought out conclusions, gathering the proper evidence before you make a recommendation, write a report, make a decision, whatever you're doing. Confidentiality. As accountants, we're privileged to see all sorts of confidential information. We see the results of the company to date. We see people's salaries. We maybe know the cost of a product versus the selling price of a product, which can be, of course, interesting to rivals. We are aware that maybe there's a takeover in progress. And if any of this information is leaked or shared, then of course it can have very adverse consequences on all sorts of stakeholders associated with the company. And finally, professional behaviour. We must comply with the law. We must avoid any action which discredits the profession in some way. Good ethical behaviour is the accountant's ultimate selling proposition. That's why people come to us and pay us good money. That's why we can command higher salaries. It's because people trust us, and the basis of trust is a good ethical approach to our work. What do we do if we do see an ethical conflict? Well, we have to identify the threat and evaluate its significance. We might see, a relatively trivial ethical threat and decide that it's not really worth bothering about. We come across these almost all the time, really. You find 10 cents on the pavement. There is, I suppose, a potential ethical conflict there. Should I take it to the police station? But most of us regard finding 10 cents on the pavement neither here nor there. We might keep it. We might give it to charity if we thought we were really ought to do something else with it. If you found $10,000 on the pavement, then of course the scale of the problem differs rather, and almost certainly you would be expected to hand that into the police station. Otherwise, actually, in the UK, you would be liable for theft, because we have a law which is called theft by finding. So, if it's not worth bothering about, don't bother about it, get over it, sort of thing. But then, if it is worth bothering about, or if you're unsure, then raise it internally. So you can raise it internally with a manager. If the manager is the source of the ethical problem, then maybe you have to go above that manager. Maybe you have to go to the audit committee. Maybe you have to go to a committee which is specially established to deal with ethical problems. You can discuss it maybe with colleagues and so on. But you might be wrong. You might be right. You might need help in coming to a conclusion. So raise it internally. If you're still unhappy that no one's taking it seriously or no adequate action is being done, then you have to raise it externally. Now, with an element of conflict here, one of the fundamental ethical concepts was confidentiality, and here we're saying we're taking potentially confidential information and raising it externally. But you would be allowed to do that, provided you're acting in good faith, and provided there was, some evidence that there was a genuine ethical concern there. So you could go to CIMA, you could ask CIMA for advice, you could take legal advice. You could maybe ask trade unions, work representatives for advice and the like. In the last resort, some countries will permit what's called whistleblowing, which is where, for example, you go to a regulatory body and complain about this organization. So if it was a pharmaceutical organization, and you thought they weren't testing their drugs properly, you could go to the government body, which is responsible for monitoring and testing of new drugs. As a last resort, you could go to a newspaper or television. But you have to be really careful indeed about that. You can't just go to the TV because you don't like your employer. You can't just go to the newspaper because they say, well, we'll pay you $10,000 for that information. If you're going to get protection under UK law, it has to be a course of action which is reasonable in the circumstances, and a course of action which you're forced into because nothing else is happening, and it has to be done in good faith. You really have to believe there's an issue here that can't be resolved any other way. Finally, if that doesn't raise any interest and you're still morally troubled, if your conscience won't let you sleep, then your only solution really is to get out. It wouldn't be showing integrity if you thought this company is doing something which is really bad. We're talking about a serious ethical transgression here, and then you stay in the company. That really isn't acting with any sort of integrity. And maybe what you have to do is simply leave. Maybe you could tell your manager, I can't work on this project because I think it's unethical. So you leave the project rather than the company. In some cases, you might actually have to leave the organization for whom you're working.